Hello. I do not do improv. I'm just putting that out there. Those guys were amazing, right? They were just incredible. And now, again, for something completely different, but we're very excited to have put together a little panel on a very important and timely subject, and they will be taking questions at the end, so you should be considering that. Doris Kearns Goodwin needs virtually no introduction here. I will simply say that aside from being the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and great presidential historian on presidents from Lincoln to Teddy Roosevelt to FDR to Johnson, she's a national treasure, and there aren't many of those. So, and Max Boot, if you haven't read his new biography on Ronald Reagan, came out last year and was voted by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of the year. I really urge you to read it. It completely changed my view of his presidency, and he's a wonderful journalist and author. This was his 5th book. He's also a senior fellow in national security studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a columnist for the Washington Post. And finally, to moderate our discussion is EVAN OSNOS, who is a wonderful friend and advisor to our conference, National Book Award-winning author, New Yorker staff writer, and the author of a terrific book on Joe Biden in 2020. And he will not just be moderating, but I hope have his own thoughts to share. So without further ado, here they come, and thanks a lot.
Welcome back, folks. I'm EVAN OSNOS, and it is, I have to say, just a joy to be back with all of you here. Bibliomaniacs, all of you, I'm pleased to say. And this is such a cherished community of this. I will also say that it is a joy to be back on this stage, as our friend Dave Barry once put it, from right here, amid the world's biggest collection of potted plants. 24 hours ago, I think a lot of you were here to hear Doris give what has to be, I think, if there's a Cooperstown for historians, I think, Doris, you're making it on the first ballot. I think we can all agree. Today, Doris is in conversation, as you heard, with the great Max Boot, whose searching portrait of Reagan is really one of the most remarkable assessments of a president that I've ever encountered. And it was described in the New Yorker magazine as it aims to be the definitive biography, and it succeeds. I have to say, that's the point in a review when the author stops reading.
Yes.
Today, we're going to be moving back and forth across the decades and the presidencies, all with the goal of trying to understand what makes some presidencies transformative, which is really, I think, our first question in a way. As we grapple with this question of why some leave deeper footprints in the sand than others, it reminds me a bit, there's a line from when Kissinger met Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, and Kissinger said, what did you make of the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai said, it's too soon to tell. Now, it turned out that was a bit of a mistranslation, but the point remains. And so, Doris, I'm curious, how often do we know in the moment that a presidency is transformative?
Well, I think we knew about Franklin Roosevelt in the moment of his inaugural address. I mean, he knew that he had to transform the morale of the people, that without that, nothing else would be possible. And that inaugural address did it. It's extraordinary. I mean, he started out saying, we always remember that there's nothing to fear but fear itself, but he started out really saying, only a foolish optimist would deny the brutal realities of the moment, but there is nothing to fear but fear itself. And then he told the people, this is not your fault. A lot of people felt it was their fault. Men would be wearing suits in the morning and walking around the village and coming home at night, even if they didn't have a job, to imagine that they had a job. He said, no, it's not your fault. It's the failure of leadership, and I am here to provide that leadership. And I will get you jobs. I will get you action. If the Congress doesn't work, I will take executive orders. This is going to happen. It was so optimistic and so hopeful that at the end of the inaugural, there were headlines saying, a leader has come. A government is here. The government still lives. And there were hundreds of thousands of letters that went into the White House. My favorite one came from a man. He said, my roof has fallen off. My dog ran away. My wife is mad at me. I've lost my job. Everything's all right. You're there. It's the mystery of leadership. And then the extraordinary thing was he realized in this first fire, but then he knew that the country had a disease. He talked about that it was sick, and the sickness was the financial system. So he had to figure out how to solve the problem that banks were running out of money. He got a bill through that solved the currency problem. But then he said, his second fireside chat was, but there's some reason why this depression happened. And he talked about the failure of regulation, the stock market. He talked about the need for the TVA. He talked about the need to put people to work. It was a systemic changes that had to place in the government. So they knew immediately that they were in the presence of something transformative. I think when we look back now, the other thing he did, besides saving us through the Depression, was to lead the Allied forces in World War II. That may be the most transformative thing that anybody's ever done in the 20th century. If that war had not been won, Western civilization and democracy would have been lost. It was one of the only wars that had to be fought for Western civilization, and his leadership was absolutely paramount. So I think that he will live forever with that. The question of whether or not government became as important as it did under him. We have Mr. Reagan coming along saying government's the problem rather than the solution, and that took a generation to change. But I have no doubt that Franklin Roosevelt will live in the minds of the people for centuries to come. I hope so. I think he deserves to.
Max Reagan, of course, came to office at a time when he was avowedly, in a way, trying to transform the mood of the country. To what degree was he perceived as a transformative president in the moment versus only later?
Well, first, let me just say what a privilege it is to be on this stage with two authors for whom I have such great reverence, and to hang out with all the other wonderful authors at this festival. But I have to say, it's not just the authors that make this a special place, it's all of you, because we authors would not have much of a future if we didn't have readers. So it's wonderful to see all these devoted readers in the audience. But, to answer your question, Evan, and kind of pick up where Doris began, there's kind of a conventional narrative of 20th century U.S. politics that FDR was the big government president. He obviously inaugurated the New Deal and created the social welfare state. And Ronald Reagan, was the anti-government president. And his most famous line in 1981 in his inaugural address was, in the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. And so there's a tendency to think that Ronald Reagan led this march away from big government. To your point, I think it's fascinating to see that. I think Reagan was in many ways a transformational president, but not in the way that people think. And I think it's somewhat of a myth to think that Reagan actually, led this revolt against big government. When people talk about the Reagan Revolution, there were significant changes primarily in his first budget in 1981, which lowered personal income tax rates, cut some federal spending. But guess what? At the end of the day, the federal government was still larger at the end of the Reagan presidency than it was when he began. And certainly he cut taxes, but he did not really cut the size of the government, which is why we had record-setting budget deficits. And yet, I would argue, Reagan was a transformational president, but he really transformed the country in two ways that I don't think people expected. The first way was he helped the country to get its mojo back after the very tumultuous and troubled 1970s, when we went through one tragedy after another, whether it was Vietnam, Watergate, the Iran hostage crisis, stagflation. The country seemed ungovernable. And so one of the ironies of the Reagan presidency, and there's so many, is that this guy who was this anti-government populist, to some extent actually restored faith in government. He made it seem like a president could actually get things done, that a president did not have to be a failure. And remember, when Reagan came in, the last two-term president had been Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s. And, you know, we saw Doris certainly was talking yesterday about, we know the terrible fate suffered by JFK, but also, you know, the end of the Johnson presidency, the end of the Nixon presidency, the end of the Carter presidency, it seemed pretty bleak, whereas Reagan was able to run for re-election in 1984 saying it's morning again in America and having people believe it. And then I think the actual most transformative aspect of his presidency was the most surprising, and that occurred in his second term when he worked with Mikhail Gorbachev to peacefully end the Cold War, which was the last thing anybody expected, because I'm just barely old enough to remember Reagan in 1980 being accused of being a warmonger. And there were a lot of people who thought, you know, Ronald Reagan today, World War III tomorrow. And what people didn't understand was he was actually a nuclear abolitionist. He wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons. His objection to the nuclear freeze was not, as so many people thought, because he wanted to start a nuclear war. His objection to the nuclear freeze was he thought it didn't go far enough. It only covered the United States and only would freeze weapons in the U.S., whereas he wanted to abolish the nuclear arsenals on both sides, which is something that very few people had any idea he believed, but he ardently believed that, and he didn't quite achieve that ambition. He and Mikhail Gorbachev at the Reykjavik summit in 1987 did talk about that. Their ambitions were not realized, but even though they didn't abolish all nuclear weapons, they did abolish medium-range ballistic nuclear missiles, and they set the United States and the Soviet Union on a trajectory that resulted just a few scant years later in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And again, the last thing that anybody would have expected, Ronald Reagan, this inveterate, hardline anti-communist going back to the 1940s, becoming friends with and working so closely with the world's #1 communist.
There is this constant question about how much do the underlying dynamics, for instance, the world that Reagan inherited, or including on the Soviet Union side, or the world that FDR inherited, how much did that push them to meet the moment? How much was it the Zelensky effect, you might say, where somebody who is not the person that we all imagine them to be becomes that? You posed this question at one point, Doris, I think in your book, Leadership in Turbulent Times. You asked really the core of this whole session, which is how much are leaders born and how much are leaders made? And I'm curious how you've come to see that after looking so deeply.
You know, I remember when I was in graduate school, these were the nerdy questions we would ask ourselves at night. How much are leaders born? How much are they made? Does the man make the times or the times make the man? And it's a wonderful question, really. I do think there are gifts that people are born with that are helpful in leadership. The gift of language for Abraham Lincoln, of course, how people could write like that. It was just an extraordinary gift. I think Teddy Roosevelt had the gift of a photographic memory, which helps a lot in politics. But most importantly, I think, I was going to say Ronald Reagan. You've got me all FDR, Ronald Reagan. FDR was born with an optimistic temperament, and I think that was huge in terms of his success. I mean, not only with the Depression, which we talked about, but think about where he was in 1940. The crucible, as you say, something hit. We were only 18th in power in 1940 when Hitler swept across Western Europe. We became 17th when Holland surrendered. So we had only 500 fighter planes. We had more horses than tanks. And he was able to see that even before Pearl Harbor, 18 months before Pearl Harbor, we had to build our military establishment up. And he knew that that meant he had to change his attitude toward the business community, which had been more hostile at the end of the New Deal. So what he does is he brings the business guys in to run his production agencies, the head of Chrysler, the head of Sears. He brings in 2 top Republicans into his cabinet, and he optimistically sees we can get this mobilization going so we can help England. Maybe that'll keep us out of the war, but if we get into the war, we'll be ready. And what he does in 18 months' time, he says 50,000 planes this first year we're going to get, which would have put us way ahead of Germany. They said, you're crazy. He said, no, I believe in America. I believe we can do it. And by God, they did it. And then the assembly line starts moving. And even before Pearl Harbor, we'd started to produce planes and ships and tanks. By 1943, we were producing a plane every 4 minutes, a tank every 7 minutes, and a ship was being launched every single day that took a year before 250 days to do it. And that was because he believed in the system, and he made the people believe. They went there for 24 hours. They worked like hell. The business and community worked with the government in the best partnership in the history of the kind of ever in our country. And it took an optimistic view. He saw ahead of time, we can do this before anybody thought we could do it.
This gets to the question of temperament in a way. And there's a bit of an awkward fact lurking in the background here, which is how much does it really matter if a president has a brilliant intellect? I mean, it was said about FDR that he had, I think it was Walter Lippmann who wrote it, he had a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament. Max, you have a fascinating quote in your book, actually, at one point. I think it was Peggy Noonan, who is generally very favorable about Reagan. But remind us what she said about his intellect. And I'm curious how you see that as being either a feature or a bug of his success in office.
Well, I think Peggy's line was something about how the battle for, Ronald Reagan's mind was something like the trench warfare of World War I, a battle over all this barren terrain. But I think there was a myth about Reagan. Clark Clifford, the Democratic wise man, referred to Reagan famously as an amiable dunce, and I think that led people to greatly underestimate him. And it was certainly true that he was no intellectual. He could be very shallow. He did not have tremendous intellectual curiosity, but he was also somebody who read all the time, somebody who was very interested in public policy and was able to grasp key points and to act on them. But I think, I cited that line about FDR with the first-class temperament and the second-class intellect. I cited that to describe Ronald Reagan as well, because in many ways, Ronald Reagan was actually very much like FDR, his boyhood hero. I mean, he worshipped FDR growing up in the 1930s, voted for FDR 4 times, and was very similar to him in personality. He had that tremendous optimism. And you ask, where did he get that optimism? And I argue in the book that it's really rooted, it's a kind of a psychological defense mechanism against his very difficult, even traumatic childhood as the son of an alcoholic shoe salesman who kept losing one job after another, and little Dutch Reagan and his brother Moon, and had to keep moving with their parents from one small town to another in Illinois in the early 20th century. And they, as Reagan liked to say, we didn't live on the wrong side of the tracks, but we were within whistling distance of the wrong side of the tracks. But he tended to put, a happy gloss on everything, and talked about his childhood in one of his memoirs as a Huck Finn idyll, which, anybody who's actually read Twain knows that Huck Finn did not have such a wonderful, easy life. But Reagan,
you may have gotten to the Cliff Notes before the full volume.
Yes. Reagan tended to romanticize his own life, but in fact it was very difficult because, his father would go out and spend the family rent money and alcohol and come back, and little Dutch Reagan and his brother Moon could hear these fierce arguments between their mother and father through the thin walls of their rented house, and never really getting close to other kids, having this terrible family secret of his father's drinking that he wanted to hide from the other kids. And his reaction to that was basically an escape into fantasy, kind of remaking the world as he wanted it to be, not as it actually was. And he would, in later life, he would even say, we never knew we were poor. It was only government bureaucrats who decided we were poor. Well, if you listen to what Moon had to say, who was not quite as poetic as his brother Ronald Reagan, Moon said, we were pretty damn poor, and they knew it. But this was, in many ways, this was Reagan's superpower, was the ability to reimagine the world as he wanted it to be, not as it was. Sometimes that was problematic because it meant that he did not grapple with difficult problems during his presidency, whether it was apartheid in South Africa or the AIDS pandemic at home. But in many ways, it was a strength because he had this tremendous optimism in America. And when he took office in 1981, as I was saying, at a pretty low moment in American history, he nevertheless talked about America as this shining city on a hill. He was convinced that our best days were ahead of us. And a lot of people were pretty skeptical, but he basically had the ability to sell his vision to the country and to convince people that what he was saying was true. And in some ways, his rhetoric helped to make it true. And I think in the way that FDR and John F. Kennedy and other presidents so powerfully deployed their oratorical skills, Reagan did as well. And I think that's one of the most effective tools in any president's arsenal.
Max talked about childhood as this formative chapter of the story. You've looked at the childhood stories of Lincoln, FDR, and of Teddy. And in some ways, we were talking about this before, that you can't really understand the man that Teddy Roosevelt became without understanding where he started.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think Teddy had such adversity in childhood and then adversity later in his young manhood. He was born with an asthma, and he remembers hearing his parents say, "I don't know whether he's going to live." Can you imagine if you're a child and you hear that? And he was pretty much of an invalid when he was a child because his asthma was so serious. But the good thing it did for him, it made him read books. I mean, he was a child who loved books, and he loved books about fearless people, the person he wanted to become. So he'd read about explorers, he would read about hunters. He became obsessed with the West because he loved the people out here who were exploring, and he wanted to be those people. James Fenimore Cooper was kind of a hero of his. But finally his father said to him, "Teddy, you know, you've got the mind but not the body. And without the body, your mind will not be able to go as far as it should. You must make your body." So the little kid says, "I will make my body." And they put a gym in their house in New York, and he worked out every day. And he becomes the most extraordinary example of the strenuous man. We think of him as this incredibly strong power. His chest expanded, and he was able to deal with his asthma because of that. But then as a young man, he suffered adversity once again, which really changed him without a question. When he was 25 years old, he was a state legislator. Things were going really well with him. He'd started off a little bit badly because he loved to be the center of the universe so much. They said he wanted to be the baby at the baptism, the bride at the wedding, and the corpse at the funeral. And he was just running around talking too much in the state legislature. He lost his fun. He became a productive legislator. He realized he'd developed a swelled head. And then one day, his wife was about to give birth to their first child. His mother, who was only 49 years old, had come to take care of her in New York while Teddy was in Albany. And he got a telegram, "Your daughter is born." They have cigars. They're celebrating. A couple hours later comes another telegram, "You must come home at once. There's a crisis in the house. Your wife is dying and your mother is dying too." And he went back to this house, and it turned out his mother had contracted typhoid fever that week. And by the time he got home, she died in his arms. 12 hours later, his wife died of complications of childbirth. It was such a depressing experience for him that he left the East Coast. He needed to get away, and he came west. He had bought a ranch the summer before, thinking he'd go every now and then. He lived 2 years in the Badlands. And being in the West, somehow the haunting beauty of the atmosphere was what created his conservation legacy. But more importantly, he said he was riding his horses 12 hours a day, and he was able to undo depression by able to sleep at night because of the exercise. But more important than that, he changed his whole attitude toward his career. He said before that he was thinking, "Okay, I'll be a state legislator, and then I'll be a state senator, and then I'll be a congressman, and then I'll be a senator, and then I'll be a governor, and then I'll be president someday." And you're too cautious each step along the way to not do anything to prevent that upward climb. But now he realized that fate can take away at any moment what your life is. I'm just going to choose a job that I want, that I think I could make a difference. Maybe it'll be my last job. So he goes back east finally from the West. He heals. He finds love again in a young girl that he had loved when he was a child. And then he gets married to her. He has a happy marriage. But more importantly, he changes his attitude toward his career. So the first job he takes is civil service commissioner. His friends say, "Why? This is below you." He said, "No, I believe in the merit system. We can't simply have a system where the political people choose the people in their jobs. We've had government under attack in this last civil service in these last months, and we've seen this as well." He knew how important it was. He made it established. Then he became police commissioner in New York. Again, they said, "Why are you doing this?" He saw slums. He saw tenements. He saw what life was like as a privileged person he never would have seen. Then he becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but he leaves that powerful post to become a soldier, a Rough Rider, and he puts in his Rough Rider tenement, in his Rough Rider regiment. He puts in his Rough Rider regiment, RRR. He puts in them Yale graduates, polo players, tennis players, along with woodsmen, along with cowboys, right together. So by the time he becomes president, he has seen all the parts of America. And the problem in the turn of the 20th century was that people in different classes and people in different religions and sections saw each other as the other rather than as common American citizens. He was able to wind all those people together in what I was saying the other day, a square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the wage worker. And he went around on a train in the country, and he went on every single state with the same message, and he bound the people together. And that was only because he'd had a broader experience that politicians don't often have. And that's why it worked. And adversity, Hemingway once said, "Everyone is broken by life, but afterwards some are strong in the broken places." How true that was for Teddy Roosevelt.
you've described this kind of layers of the sediment of ambition kind of accumulating over time. And I'm curious, as you look at Reagan's life, you know, if you had met him when he was in his 20s, you would not have said this man wants to be the President of the United States, or perhaps you would have. How did you understand the degree to which it is private ambition, Max, is the ambition to be the man, to be the great man, versus the ambition to ultimately project an idea of the country outward?
Well, one of the reasons why I think Reagan was so successful as he was, and I think this is true of many successful elected leaders, was he pretended that he had no ambition, that he was simply hearing the call of the people and they were drafting him to run for office. But in fact, he was intensely ambitious, as you would expect from somebody who came from these extremely humble small-town roots in early 20th century Illinois, to rise to the heights of Hollywood stardom and then ascend the political ladder. I mean, the funny thing about Reagan is how life could have been different if he had gotten the job that he applied for in 1932 when he was graduating from Eureka College. And 1932 was one of the worst years in American history, at the very depths of the Great Depression, and jobs were not easy to come by. But Montgomery Ward was building a new store in his hometown of Dixon, Illinois, and they wanted a manager for the sporting goods department. And they were hoping to get somebody who had been a high school or college athlete, and both of which Dutch Reagan had been. He was on the football team in high school, and in college he was also actually even a better swimmer than he was a football player. And so he applied for this job after graduating from Eureka, and he did not get it. And you imagine what would have happened if he had gotten it, because the guy who did get it was still working at Montgomery Ward in the 1970s when Ronald Reagan came to town running for president of the United States. So that, you know, he was not destined to spend his life working in retail in his hometown. What he really wanted to do was to be an actor, but he realized he didn't know how do you get from Dixon, Illinois to Hollywood, California. It seemed like too fantastic a leap for this small-town poor boy at the height of the Great Depression. But he figured out there's no movie studios in the Midwest, but there are radio stations. And so he caught on with a small radio station in Iowa and very quickly made the jump to a bigger radio station in Des Moines. And so he became known as Dutch Reagan, the voice of the Chicago Cubs and the White Sox. And he became a fairly well-known figure in the Midwest in the 1930s. It was making good money, you know, especially at the height of the Great Depression. And a lot of people would have been satisfied with that, but he wasn't. And so one year when the Chicago Cubs were going to spring training at Catalina Island off the coast of California, he convinced his tightwad station owner to finance a trip for him to accompany the trip, the team to spring training, on the grounds that he would do a better job of announcing their games if he spent a little time with the players. But when he was out there on Catalina Island, he snuck away to Warner Brothers in Burbank and took a screen test. And lo and behold, Jack Warner saw the screen test, liked what he saw, and hired Dutch Reagan. And so by the late 1930s, this guy who had graduated from this tiny college nobody had ever heard of in small-town Illinois had become not only a celebrity in the Midwest, but was rapidly becoming well-known to moviegoers around the world. And of course, then later on, when his movie career petered out, he kind of made the transition to politics. And in 1966, he had the temerity to challenge Pat Brown, two-term governor of California. And this is Ronald Reagan, former actor, never run for office in his life, but he trounced Pat Brown by 1 million votes. And what is the first thing he did after winning the governorship of the most populous state? A few weeks later, in the fall of 1966, he sat down with his political advisors at his home in Pacific Palisades and started talking about how he could run for president in 1968, immediately after being elected governor. And of course, later on, he pretended this campaign had never happened because, of course, he lost the nomination to Richard Nixon. So he pretended he had never won it in the first place. But his ambition was so intense that he was not satisfied with being elected governor of California. First thing he does immediately, plotting to run for president of the United States.
What comes through in a number of the cases we've been talking about, certainly in Reagan's case, in FDR's case, is the fact that there was inevitably the private person and the public person. And the mediating step in between was their command of the technologies of the time. They had to figure out how do I appear to be the person that the public needs me to be? In FDR's case, we all think of him now, of course, as having mastered the fireside chats. But how much was this a revolution at the time? How much was this an intuitive move on his part?
It's a really interesting question. When he made his first fireside chat on the radio, he was so nervous, they said, that his hands were shaking. And he was practicing in the other room. He knew he was going in before the radio thing. He knew that he had to appear, and this is what Reagan did as well, to have an intimacy with the public. He wanted all of his speeches for the fireside chats to be written with one-syllable words, if possible. Somebody wrote a speech for him saying, "We want a more inclusive society," and he changed it to, "We want a society in which no one is left out." I want to picture, when he was doing a radio chat, I want to picture a girl who's working in a department store. I want to picture a guy who's working in the mines. I want them to understand what I'm saying. And he had the perfect voice for the radio, so that's, sometimes it matters whether the technology fits the talent you have. It was a voice that made people feel that he was their friend. And he started off all these fireside chats saying, "Hello, my friends. Good evening, my friends." Not, "I am your president. I am your friend." And in fact, when he died, people said, "We've lost our friend." That was an extraordinary thing. So in that first fireside chat, when he talked about the banking crisis, people felt that he was giving them an understanding of what the crisis was. You put your money in a bank, and don't worry about it. It doesn't just stay there. That's why they don't have the currency right now, because it's going to be loaned out to make the economy move. But we're going to get those banks that don't have the money there because they put it in the stock market or because too many people are taking it out. We're going to get it all right, I promise you. It's better we'll get the currency there. It's better for you to bring your money back to the bank than keep it in your mattress. They were worried the next day when the banks reopened that people would bring their money back because they'd been closed for a week. They brought their money back because they believed in him. And what happened is people said, Saul Bellow said you could walk down the street on a hot Chicago night and you could listen to his giving a speech. You could hear his voice, and people were staring at their radios in their kitchen or their living room. And you could keep walking down the street and not miss a word of what he was saying because everyone was listening to the speech. There's a story of a construction worker running home one night, and his partner said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, my president, he's coming to speak to me in my living room and I must be there tonight to greet him when he comes." So people would say to him during the war in particular, "You should go on the radio every night. It's the only way to sustain morale, to have your speeches there." And his speeches came at just the right time. He said, "No, if my speeches ever become routine, they will lose their effectiveness." So there's a wonderful speech he makes in 1942. It's called the MAP speech. And he knows that people are so depressed because we've had Pearl Harbor, we're losing in the Pacific, and he's got to increase their morale. But he's also got to teach people things may go bad before we get well. So he talked about the fact he wanted everybody to get a map and put it before them so he could show them what was happening in the Pacific and why that mattered to us here. They said the man at C.S. Hammond said he had sold more maps that week than he had sold in an entire year. And then even at the bottom of the paper, I read, in the old days, you should read it in the microfilm, so you'd actually read the whole paper. And I saw somebody wrote in, and he said, even his wife, the C.S. Hammond's guy said, "Even my wife, who doesn't like maps, asked me to bring a map home." And I'm thinking, what kind of a marriage did they have? They've been married 50 years, and she doesn't like maps. Anyway, everybody has their maps in front of them. And by the end of that, he's explained what it was all about. And he's able to make people feel that he's talking to them intimately. And that's a huge possibility. But let it not be seen that he didn't work on those. He prepared those speeches 3 or 4 nights. The speechwriters would live at the White House on the second floor. They'd go over the speeches. He'd read them out loud. And then he'd go over it and over it again. He was nervous before it. And then the minute the radio thing was put on, there he was, your friend. And as I said, when he died, people said, "We've lost our friend." They put their arms around one another and held arms and said, "Our friend is gone." And that's an extraordinary thing to happen.
Before we go forward in time, I want to stay with you, Doris, for a second on this question of that capacity to communicate. What we now know of Lincoln, of course, is that he was an anguished man. He was tortured. And I wonder, in the age of television, if Lincoln would have been the same kind of president to people. Would actually that have been an impediment to his ability?
What a great question. I'd like to believe that Lincoln was born with a melancholy temperament and he had a terrific difficulties to overcome, but that the qualities he had would have transcended any time. I really do believe it. It's interesting when we talked about ambition. It's the mystery of ambition. How did Lincoln get from that hard scrabble farm that he was living on, where he had to educate himself. He only had 1 full year of schooling. His father would take him out of school to help on the farm. His father would loan him out to other farmers who needed money, and then he would have to go away from school. The only thing he loved was school. And maybe that's where his confidence and maybe his ambition came from, because he could see that he was the smartest kid in the class. But most importantly, for all of us, it came from reading. He said that by reading, he was able to imagine another way of life from the life that he had then. His father would take the books away from him, thinking he was being lazy by reading books. But books gave him that sense that I can be something other than I am. Emily Dickinson once said, there's no frigate like a book to take us lands away. And when he didn't have books in school and he didn't have books at home, he would hear about a book somewhere else that he could loan. He walked 20 miles at one point to get a grammar book. I can imagine him. Can you imagine if he could walk here 60 miles for this conference? He would have loved it more than anything in the world. I mean, that's what the magic of books is. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt said about books that the most important thing about a leader is to understand human nature. And the best way to understand human nature is by reading the great books of prose and poetry. So he knew poetry, he knew drama. He could have spoken to us in high language even today. But he was also a great debater. When he was in the debates with Stephen Douglas, and people would yell at him, they said to him one time, Lincoln, you're two-faced. And he was able to respond immediately with humor. Humor is a quality we really need in our leaders. He said, if I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this face? But then, once he became president, he didn't want to speak extemporaneously. He was so good at it, but he knew, and that's why he'd be troubled, I think, in a world today where you're demanded to say something at every moment. When he was called on, when a Union battle would be won, and they'd come to the White House to serenade him, and they'd say, speech, we want a speech. And he said, no, let's just sing a song tonight. Let's praise the soldiers. I will speak when I'm ready. He wanted to prepare. He knew that words can hurt, words can divide, as well as words can excite. And so he would wait until he could say the right thing and form his language.
Max, you know, Reagan was funny. He was, even after he'd been shot, you reminded me of this, I forget, even after he was shot, he was gravely wounded, and he says to his surgeons, I hope you're all Republicans.
Which is great.
He was a master.
And the doctor came back and said, we're all Republicans today, Mr. President.
He was, of course, a trained performer. I'd like to connect this to an interesting matter of the soul, which is actually about empathy. Because, in a way, somebody who is a great performer can perhaps perform the qualities of empathy, make it seem as if it is in them. There was a line after he died, I think it was the great Mark Shields, the great columnist.
Oh, I remember him.
Many of us miss, who said Reagan was a man of enormous sympathy, yet little empathy. It's a really interesting idea. You quoted it. I wonder what you make of that and how you think about him as his assets and his liabilities on the matter of empathy.
Well, Reagan could be a very remote personality. I mean, I think this is one of the things people didn't understand about him because, you know, he was kind of a character on TV dating back to the 1950s, and he was one of two individuals to ever host a national television show before becoming president of the United States. And so people felt like, you know, he was in their living rooms. They felt like they knew him, this very warm, avuncular guy.
Don't say it, by the way. Don't say the name.
Yes.
Don't. Doing so well. Go on.
I didn't say nothing.
You sure didn't.
But so people felt like they knew him. But in fact, he was very inscrutable and hard to know. I mean, Stu Spencer, his longtime political consultant dating back to 1966, who sadly just died recently, and Stu was one of my best interview subjects. The line that Stu used for me was, Reagan would have made a pretty good hermit. He didn't really need people. He was very happy. His idea of a great evening was to, you know, come home early from work, get into his jammies, sit down with Nancy with TV trays and, you know, eat dinner while watching Bonanza or Gunsmoke or something like that. He didn't have any desire to socialize. She pushed him out of the house. Their friends were really her friends. He was just as happy to read and to enjoy his solitude. And, you know, that he definitely he was not the most empathetic person. He often did not know what was going on with his own kids. He didn't know that, you know, his son had been sexually abused, or his daughter had been beaten by her husband, or another daughter had used various drugs. And so this was all kind of a blur that was going on beyond his understanding, because he kind of interacted with people on a fairly amiable level, somewhat superficial level of amiability. And so I think the downside of that was that it could make him somewhat hard-hearted when he dealt with people who were victims that he did not know. And so he was not sufficiently moved by the plight of AIDS victims in the 1980s, at least not until, to some extent, Rock Hudson died of the disease, and Rock Hudson was finally somebody that he knew who had the disease, so it made it a little bit more real for him. Or he was not moved by the plight of black South Africans, because he didn't know a lot of black South Africans, and he had this terrible meeting in the Oval Office with Bishop Tutu, where he was telling Bishop Tutu, the Archbishop of South Africa, that he, Archbishop Tutu, did not really understand the tribal divisions in his own country. And Ronald Reagan was somebody who had never once visited South Africa. So these horrible, there were certainly a number of examples of this horrible lack of empathy and understanding. But when Ronald Reagan was actually confronted with an individual person with a name and a face, he acted very differently. And I ran across this wonderful correspondence in the Reagan archives that he had with these two women from the 1960s on, who were living in this very small town in California, caring for a developmentally challenged brother, and they were very, they were very impoverished, didn't have a lot of money, and so they would write to the governor, talking about their woes and saying how, they weren't getting some payment from Social Security or from some other, agency, and then he would, write little checks to them. At one point, he actually had his staff take his rocking chair and send it to these women, because they said that they wanted something like a rocking chair. So he sent his own rocking chair. They wanted to, they were writing scripts for Westerns, which were not very good, but he contacted movie studios and tried to get these movie studios to make their movies. And he wasn't doing any of this for publicity. Nobody had any idea this was going on. This was something I unearthed, this correspondence that went on for year after year. And believe me, most politicians would just fob somebody like that off on their staff and, say, like, who cares, whatever, this is not an issue that's going to get me votes. But Ronald Reagan was personally himself writing these letters and was very deeply moved by their plight, just as he was later moved by the plight of the families of hostages in Lebanon or others. When he could actually see the victims face to face, he had a very human, very empathetic reaction, but he had kind of a failure of imagination, for example, when he didn't think about people who were losing food stamps or aid to families with dependent children as a result of his budget cuts during the 1981 to 1983 recession.
This may sound like a shift of gears, but it's related in a sense. Doris, you've thought a lot and written about. Some of the most interesting passages are when you describe what presidents did to repair, to relax, honestly, to just get away from the actual job of it. Why is that it is an important piece of how you understand the presidency. What were some of the ways that it mattered to them?
I think is probably one of the most underappreciated aspects of leadership, the ability to find time to think, to relax and replenish energies. You've got to be able to keep going back on that job. And each of my guys, I don't mean to be undeferential by calling them my guys, it's just that I lived with Lincoln and Franklin and Teddy and LBJ so long, were able to do that. Lincoln actually went to the theater 100 times during the Civil War. He said when the lights went down and a Shakespeare play was on, for a few precious hours he could imagine himself back at the War of the Roses and not involved in the Civil War. And then his other great form of relaxation was his sense of humor. When cabinet meetings were tough and people were really upset with one another, he would come out with a funny story. Sometimes they were like Aesop's fables. Sometimes they were just some funny story. One of the favorite stories he loved to tell had to do with a Revolutionary War hero, and he told this over and over again, Ethan Allen, who was invited to England after the war, and the English people were having a dinner party, and they decided to embarrass him by putting a huge picture of General George Washington in the only outhouse where he'd have to encounter it sooner or later. They figured he'd be pissed off at the idea that George was in an outhouse, but he came out not upset at all, Lincoln said. And then the British said to him, well, didn't you see George Washington there? Oh, yes, he said. I think it was the perfectly appropriate place for him. What do you mean? They said. Well, there's nothing to make an Englishman shit faster than the sight of General George Washington. And he had hundreds of these stories, and he would tell these stories. I had Daniel Day-Lewis told the story in the movie, and he told it so great. Teddy Roosevelt relaxed by having 2 hours of exercise every day, no matter what happened. It could be a boxing match, it could be a wrestling match. His most famous form of relaxation, however, was to walk on the hills and the cliffs of Rock Creek Park. And he would take people along, and he had a specific imposition. You could not go around any obstacle. You had to go through it. So if you came to a rock, you had to go over it. If you came to a precipice, you had to go. People would fall by the wayside, and they hated these walks. But the famous story was told by Jules Jusserand, the French ambassador. He was so excited when he was invited to this first walk with the president to relax with him. He was wearing his nice suit as if they'd be in the Champs-Élysées. He finds himself going over rocks, he can't bear it. Finally, they get to the river, and he thinks, thank God, this is going to be over. But then he sees Teddy Roosevelt say, well, this is an obstacle. We can't go around it, so no sense in getting our clothes wet. Let's undress. So I'm going to have another naked man story here. So Jules Jusserand says, well, for the honor of France, I had to unbutton my clothes and undo my apparel. But I left on my lavender kid gloves. Why? Because it might be embarrassing if we should meet ladies on the other side. So anyway, there's a plaque to Jules Jusserand in Rock Creek Park. But the best form of relaxation, and it shows the contrast between Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan, who you say he wanted to be a hermit, wanted to be alone. Franklin Roosevelt never wanted to be alone. It may have been because of his paralysis. He was afraid to be alone. He just needed people around him. And during World War II, he had a cocktail party every night, and the rule was you couldn't talk about the war. You could talk about books you'd read, you could talk about movies you'd seen, you could talk about gossip. He loved gossip. And after a while, this cocktail party mattered so much to him that he wanted to have the regulars who would be ready for the cocktail party to live on the second floor of the White House with him. So the White House became the most exclusive residential hotel you could possibly imagine. His foreign policy advisor, Harry Hopkins, came for dinner one night, slept over, never left until the war came to an end. Missy LeHand, his secretary, lived right there on the second floor with them. Lorena Hickok, Eleanor's great friend, had a bedroom next to hers. The princess from Norway, Princess Martha, came and spent the weekends there. And, of course, the great Winston Churchill came and spent weeks at a time right there on the second floor of the White House. So when I was writing and finishing the book about No Ordinary Time, I just wanted to know where each of them had slept, in what room up there. I'd been up to that second floor with Lyndon Johnson when I was working for him, but I wasn't asking then, where was Franklin, where was Eleanor, where was Harry Hopkins? So I mentioned this on a radio program in Washington, and it happened that Hillary Clinton, then in the White House, was listening. So she called me up at the radio station and invited me to a sleepover in the White House. She said we could then wander the corridor together and figure out where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So a couple of weeks later, she invited my husband and me to a state dinner, after which between midnight and 2 a.m., the President, the First Lady, and I, with my map in hand, went through every room up there and figured out, yes, Chelsea Clinton is sleeping where Harry Hopkins was, Bill Clinton and Hillary were sleeping where FDR was, and we were sleeping in Winston Churchill's bedroom. There was no way I could sleep. He was sitting in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking his ever-present cigar. In fact, that room is my favorite story in World War II, which is when Churchill came there right after Pearl Harbor. He and Roosevelt were set to sign a document that put the Associated Nations against the Axis powers, but no one liked the word Associated Nations. So early that morning, Roosevelt awakened with a whole new idea of calling them the United Nations against the Axis powers. He was so excited he had himself wheeled into Churchill's bedroom, our bedroom, to tell him the news. Oh my God, there's going to be another naked man. But it so happened that Churchill was coming out of the bathtub and had nothing on. So Roosevelt said, I'm so sorry, I'll come back in a few moments. Churchill, incredibly, standing up, still dripping from the tub, stands to his full height and says, oh no, please stay. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States. So then Roosevelt tells him the idea of using the United Nations instead of Associated Nations. He embraces it at once, has the further presence of mind, still dripping from the tub, to tell him of a poem that had once been written in British literature where the words United Nations had been used. So the next morning I couldn't wait to go in the bathtub, and then I truly felt I was in the presence of the greatness of the past.
I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. I know there are folks here who have a lot of questions for this duo. So why don't we turn to that now? I think we've got microphones that are going to make their way around, and our friend John may help us identify folks in the crowd if it's hard for me to see.
Is a woman or gentleman in pink there?
It's a question I hate to ask, but is there any question, I won't mention the name, is there any question that the current president will be viewed as a transformative president?
Oh, that one coming.
Who drew the short straw backstage? I can't remember.
He's going.
I mean, I think this is no endorsement of the incumbent, believe me, when I say I think he is a transformational president, but, transforming in a lot of ways that I would rather not see the country transformed. But I think it's going to be hard to know the full import of that until many years later. And this is part of the reason why it's usually the case that presidential biographies are not written until many years after the president has left office. And I felt like I had an advantage in writing about Ronald Reagan all these decades after his presidency, because when you've kind of got your face pressed up against the glass, as Edmund Morris, his official biographer, did in the 1990s, it's hard to know exactly what all this means. You really need the passage of time. And so, for example, with the passage of time with Ronald Reagan, some of the things that seem like terrible scandals and controversies in the 1980s don't loom so large. I mean, yes, Iran-Contra was a terrible scandal, but we have worse scandals every day of the week now in Washington. The budget deficits back then seemed pretty high, but they're actually pretty anemic compared to the budget deficits of today, whereas other things that were not terribly controversial at the time, for example, the fact that President Reagan largely ignored the AIDS pandemic. He wasn't being criticized by Democrats for that in the 1980s, but I think in the court of history, he is held to account, or the way that he catered to white backlash politics throughout his political career, including during his presidency. That, again, was not a big subject of criticism at the time, but in hindsight, it looms larger. So, I think, for better or for worse, and probably for worse, the current president is going to be a transformational one, but it's very hard to know right now what exactly will be lasting in that transformation and what will be transient.
Thanks. Anyone else? There's a question down here. Where's the front? You have somebody over there? Okay. Yep, thanks. To the left?
With all due respect...
Oh, sorry, she's over there on the left. Yeah, that's you.
Yeah.
With all due respect to the passage of time, Evan, I wanted to ask you, you've written a book about Joe Biden, about his temperament and intellect.
I think this is a prime example of one in which the history is still being written. I think we're still learning how to understand the role he played in history. I think that part of the story of his presidency is that there was almost a change in his perception of the presidency between the time he was elected and the time he arrived in office. Because between that November and January 20th was the most violent assault on the U.S. Capitol in our history, or certainly in a century. And as a result, that transformed truly his perception of the stakes and the ambitions that were possible. And I think what's contained in that is all of what we know, which is the decision, for instance, to run for a second term, which I think is now generally understood to have been a catastrophic decision for him and for the country and for the Democratic Party. But part of the reason why he came to that view was because he believed that history, in a sense, had called him to the moment that he, in his own mind, began to compare to FDR. And I think it comes down to this issue, ultimately, of whether a person can perceive what the country wants of them. Right. And when you misread what the country wants of you, then you're prone to make terrible mistakes. But I actually am of the view that, and this actually gets to something that is very much in Doris's work, that as in the case of LBJ, at the end of LBJ's life, he did not know, and neither did we as a country, really what his legacy would look like and how we would talk about it, both the positives and the negatives. And I think that's a fair assessment of where Biden is today.
And I think what happened with LBJ was that in those last years when I was with him working on the memoir, he was just so hoping that people would remember civil rights as well as the war in Vietnam. He knew that the war had cut his legacy in two, but he liked to believe that what he'd been able to do in civil rights and voting rights, even in all the Great Society programs, which he thought were social justice programs as well as aid to education or Medicare or Medicaid. And sadly, he didn't know that before he died, but historians have given him credit now. He keeps coming up in the presidential polls. We now have an awareness that it was extraordinary what happened in civil rights and in voting rights, in Medicare, in Medicaid, in aid to education, all the things I talked about yesterday. And I'm glad that his children are alive to see that happening. In fact, in one recent poll, he was even put ahead of JFK. How happy he would have been to know that. But in most polls now, they're realizing that, yes, the war was handled badly. The war is a complication thing. It will always be a scar on his legacy. But the bipartisan leadership that he showed, and especially at a time when we're not seeing that very much anymore, to reach across to the Republicans to break that filibuster, the convictions that he had for the huge changes in social justice, economic opportunity in this country, a creative hope for this country that we hadn't seen since FDR, that he's going to be remembered for that. And I'd like to believe that all of us here understand that what happened in voting rights, what happened in civil rights, it may be being cut back today, but it is fundamental to our country that people have the right to vote, and that the most people we should be having more people have the right to vote rather than less people have the right to vote. There's nothing worse than what's happening right now. And it just... In fact, LBJ said the most fundamental right is the right to vote. It's on which every other right and freedom depends. And I think for that he will be regarded. I only wish he had known. The last speech he gave before he died was at the LBJ library, and they were opening the civil rights papers. And everybody was giving him progress and what he had done there. And he got up there and he said his heart was already failing. He had to take a nitroglycerin tablet when he went up to this. His voice was very soft. He would die six weeks later. But he said, I don't want to talk about the progress I made. We didn't make nearly enough. Let's talk about what we can do now. Much more is needed. And what a wonderful last thing to say, I didn't do nearly as much as I wish I had done. The country needs to go much further. His memory will be regarded well. I wish he had known it before he died.
Can I just say one fast thing, Evan? Because I will say, I think when you think about to what extent will the current president be transformational, the one whose name I'm not allowed to mention, I think a lot of that will be in our hands. It will really be up to the country and the people who follow him in office, because I think what you're seeing is an unprecedented assault on the institutions of our government and on the very fundamentals of our democracy. And I think it will be up to us whether that assault succeeds or not. And if our democracy survives, if our government can be repaired, then perhaps this president will not be as transformational as he seeks to be. But it's possible he may very well succeed in his ambitions, but that's not going to be his doing. It's going to be up to the rest of us.
Yeah.
I think question over here.
Hi, my name is Annie Berlin, and this is my first visit to the conference, and I want to thank each of you for your thoughtful answers. Max, I have a specific, I guess it's more like a family question. A good friend of mine in McLean, Virginia, was nominated by Ronald Reagan to run the AIDS Commission. And I know you've mentioned the AIDS crisis a couple times. Did you ever come across a gentleman by the name of Admiral James Watkins in your research?
Yes, I did. He was a former chief of naval operations who was, in fact, the head of an AIDS commission that was appointed late in President Reagan's term. And he was somebody who I think pushed for greater action on AIDS, along with folks like C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General of the United States, as well as an obscure young doctor named Anthony Fauci, who was at the National Institutes for Health at the time. So there were a lot of people in... So there were a lot of people in government who were pushing for action on this horrible pandemic. But there was also countervailing pressure from the religious right, who were basically viewing the AIDS pandemic as, God's punishment to gay people and didn't want to do anything about it. And so Reagan was kind of in the middle and torn about it. As I suggested, he didn't really have a good understanding of this terrible toll this disease was taking, and started to understand it when Rock Hudson died. It started getting closer to his own life, but he never really took it as seriously as it deserved. And I think there was still quite a bit done during the Reagan administration, thanks to folks like Dr. Fauci, Dr. Koop, and also in the Senate, folks like Senator Ted Kennedy and others who were fighting for that AIDS funding and research. But there was a dearth of presidential leadership on that issue.
Thanks. We've got time for one more question. No pressure. Way in the back. Up on the left, way in the back.
Hi. You've talked a lot about legacies. I was wondering what legacy each of you hope to leave.
Wow.
Doris?
You know, it's interesting. We think about presidential legacies a lot and how they wanted to be remembered over time. But I think all of us want to leave a story behind. I've often talked about the fact that my father taught me that mysterious art of keeping baseball scores when I was 6 years old. And I could tell him the game of the Brooklyn Dodgers when he came home. I learned to tell a story that way. And he died when I was in my 20s. My mother died when I was 15. They've lived on, I think, beyond the presidential books that I've written, because I wrote about them in a memoir. I feel like my husband has lived on because of an unfinished love story. And if I can make people who lived lives that were ordinary lives, as well as the presidential people lived lives, all of us want to have our story told. I mean, there's a sense in which it'll be our family and our friends and our colleagues telling that story. Just to talk about the baseball thing for me is a way of thinking about this. Though my father died before I got married and had my 3 sons, I've passed my love of baseball on to my sons, though it's not the Brooklyn Dodgers anymore because they abandoned me and went to Los Angeles. It became the Red Sox. So we go to games so many times, and I sit there with my kids, and I'm thinking that I'm really back in Ebbets Field with my father watching the players of my youth on the grassy fields below, Jackie Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snider. And then I open my eyes and I see my sons in the place where my father once sat, and they never met their grandfather, but they've heard about him through all the stories that I have told. So I think the way I'd like to be remembered is as somebody who was able to bring people who no longer are alive with their kindness, their compassion, as I would like to be remembered as a person, what I've brought to my children and my grandchildren, and that story can be told somehow, and that's how we live on.
Yeah. Tough act to follow.
That's a tough act to follow and a tough question to answer. Not one I've done a lot of book events, never had that question asked. I guess I would say I would hope to be remembered as somebody who did his best to help people understand our country's past as well as our present, and to understand the stakes involved in both our history and our current debates. And, you know, to quote the famous Teddy Roosevelt line about fighting for the right is the greatest sport that the world allows. I mean, I hope that I will be remembered as somebody who fought for the right to the best of my abilities. And that's, you know, it often feels like I must say, it often feels like kind of a hopeless struggle, because it feels like, you know, producing books, producing articles in our current time of troubles is like casting stones into the ocean. It feels, you know, like an exercise in futility. But I don't, the stakes are too important. The country means too much for all of us and to the world to give up hope. And I think we have to keep fighting for what we believe in, to keep fighting for the principles that this country has stood for. And I think great history of the kind that Doris writes, or great journalism of the kind that Evan writes, can help illuminate the stakes and make us understand what this country is all about, and to draw the appropriate lessons for how we should shape the country into the future. And if I can contribute in some teeny small way to all of that, I will feel like I lived a life well lived.
If I could just add on to that.
Please.
I think you raised something really important. For those of us who are historians, this is a time when history is itself under attack, when books are being banned in places, when fewer people are studying history, when fewer majors in history in college. For those of us who love history, if we can make 1 or 2 people love history more, everybody should love history. If it's taught right, it's about conflict, it's about personalities, it's about our past. And as I said the other day, if we learn from history, it's perspectives, it's solace, and it's hope. And we need history now more than ever. And if we can contribute a little way, even by these conversations about history, then I'll feel that we've done our job as historians.
I'd say like one 30-second point to follow on what Doris says. And
why not? We'll stay here all night.
We're all in violent agreement here. But I mean, remember the guy whose name I'm not supposed to mention, who resides in the White House today, he weaponizes history and distorts history in the service of his own agenda. And if you listen to the president, you would think that the 1890s was the most prosperous and wonderful era in American history, and the McKinley terrorists were responsible for all the great prosperity.
And we were all rich, he says.
And we've all become rich. So I think it's utterly essential. It's an act of fidelity to history and a service to the country to set people straight and to make them understand what the historical reality is and how different it is from the way it's portrayed from the bully pulpit today.
And could I add one more thing?
Please.
I think part of the problem of the way history is now being projected by the current administration is that we shouldn't talk about troubling times. It makes people feel embarrassed to talk about Jim Crow or to talk about the Civil War. The way we've become what we are is we've came through troubling times and we became better as a result. We have to not tell people they shouldn't learn about the difficult times. Yes, we wish our leaders were different in the past. Yes, they weren't what we want, but they did what they could and they tried what they could. And if we don't understand how we went through those troubling times and became better, then we're never going to understand our own history. So there's so much to learn from this.
I have nothing to add.
I hope to be remembered as the guy wise enough not to speak after these.
Thank you.
Well done.
That was
Best line of the night.